Hey, welcome to Pause on Purpose. I'm Pastor Paul. Thanks for joining us. Last week we talked about if we were the offendee, if we offended somebody, and we also began the whole process of finding joy and forgiveness by considering it from God's perspective and how He views forgiveness and how it's so important to Him. This week we're going to look at what if we're the offended? What if we've been offended? And the proverbial question comes up all the time. How often should I forgive someone? And that's not really a new question at all. Peter asked that question to Jesus in Matthew chapter 18, verse 21. He said to Jesus, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? See, he thought he was being super spiritual because the Pharisees at that time thought that 2 to 3 times was more than you need to forgive someone. I guess they believed, shame on, if you burn me once, shame on you. If you burn me twice, shame on me. And so Peter thought he was being extra spiritual by saying up to 7 times. But there's something about God and forgiveness. And what Jesus responds with, he says, no, not up to 7 times, but 70 times 7. And he wasn't saying 490 times, meaning take it literally. He was basically saying an infinite. 7 and 70, those are numbers that mean that are equivalent to God and his perfection. So Jesus was basically saying, as many times as you need to forgive them, forgive them. And then he gives this great parable as an illustration. It's a little bit long, so bear with me. I'm in Matthew 18, verses 23 through 34. It says, for this reason, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his slaves. And when he begun to settle them, one who owed him 10,000 talents, which was like $10 million right now in our day, all right? A lot of money, right? He said the guy owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. But since this gentleman didn't have the means to repay, his master commanded that he be sold along with his wife and children and all that he had, and repayment be made. In other words, liquidate. And back then, they would throw you in prison until you could repay the debt. Well, that was never going to happen. That was an insurmountable amount of money, like it would be today, and there would be no way he could ever pay that back. So the slave fell to the ground, prostrated himself before him, saying, have patience with me, and I'll repay you everything. Well, that was merely impossible. He was just trying to save his own skin. And the master of the slave felt compassion. Notice that phrase. The master of the slave felt compassion and released him and forgave him the debt. Notice he released him and forgave the debt. Very, very, very critical. But that slave went out and found one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii, which is like, maybe a few $100. And he seized him and began to choke him, saying, pay back what you owe. So his fellow slave fell to the ground and began to plead with him, saying, have patience with me, and I'll repay you. But he was unwilling, and he went and threw him in prison until he would pay him back what was owed. So when his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were deeply grieved and came and reported to their master all that had happened. Then summoning him, his master said, you wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt. Remember, this is the master who forgave this slave initially over $10 million, right? He says, I forgave you all that because you plead with me. Should you not have also had mercy on your fellow slave in the same way that I had mercy on you? I mean, this guy only owed you like a couple $100 and you couldn't forgive him? And his master, moved with anger, handed over him to the torturers until he would repay all that was owed him. The king who forgave the wicked slave that $10, $20 million was absolutely amazed and incredibly frustrated at this unforgiveness of this slave, because he gave he gave this guy a big break by forgiving him almost $10 million, which would have required infinite forgiveness, right? This represents, if you will, what we would call vertical forgiveness between God and us. The king didn't forgive the slave because the slave was good, or maybe the guy saved his life in a war or something like that. No, the master was more concerned about his relationship with God, and he knew that if he didn't forgive, it would affect his relationship with God. The horizontal view comes into play in verses 28 through 24 or 34. The same slave that had forgiven this incredible debt, went back out and would not forgive the other slave. When the king got word of that, he pulled that slave back in, and he was livid. He just had enough, and he threw him back in there. So let's learn a couple principles. And the first principle is this, and it's this: when we refuse to forgive, it's an internal contradiction. We're almost like a walking oxymoron, because we're not saying what we truly believe. We're not saying that God can forgive me then. Because of all that God has forgiven me, I need to be able to say I can forgive other people. To not do that is an internal contradiction to what we actually believe. If God forgave us of our infinite amount of sins, to the point where you could never pay back God the righteousness he deserves for all that we've done, surely we can forgive this person of one thing that they've done to us. That's the whole point. Tomorrow we'll learn the other principle from it. But for today, here it is. For me not to forgive and hold it against somebody else is a walking contradiction. I tell you, beloved, for me, I struggle with this with just as much as the next person. Sometimes if someone burns me, okay, God gives me the grace and I'm able to forgive. But there's sometimes things just fester. And I need to remember this principle just like everybody else. To not forgive is to live a walking contradiction. And to realize that forgiveness is more about my relationship with God than it actually is with my relationship with that person. Because if I say I can't forgive this person, I'm really saying I don't believe God can forgive me. You think about that and then go with God, right? Because God's with us.